Hello, and welcome to another episode of Back Issue Book Club. I'm your host, Kelly Guentner. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Back Issue Book Club. This week, in case you couldn't tell, we're talking about Huntress. Specifically, the Helena Bertinelli version of Huntress. Now, for those who don't know, and it's fine if you don't, DC Comics has two main versions of Huntress. They have Helena Wayne, who was Silver Age, so prior to 1985. She was Earth 2, so a parallel version of Earth where Batman and Catwoman were a little older. Catwoman was retired and had gone to prison, and then they'd gotten married and had a daughter, and so Huntress was their daughter, all grown up. And then 1985 came along, and DC did a reboot called Crisis on Infinite Earths and wiped out all of that, all of their parallel Earths, and eventually they reintroduced a new Huntress called Helena Bertinelli. Super confusing, right? Why they felt the need to do this, I don't know. I love both Huntresses. Helena Bertinelli is one of my favorite characters overall. This specific book that we're talking about, cover doesn't really show it. This is the re-release of an old story as a tie-in to the Birds of Prey movie. The story itself is Batman Huntress, Cry for Blood. Let's see, we have, this is what one of the covers look like for the miniseries. And this is another story that stands on its own even if you don't know the history of the characters involved. If you do know the history of the characters involved, it definitely doesn't shy away from the history, but the story itself really hints at the history of the characters involved and establishes it pretty well. It's also a really good character-driven story, and it's the number one story I recommend to anyone who wants to understand the Huntress, because it's really just tells you everything you need to know about Helena Bertinelli. It does tell her origin. It's not specifically an origin story because it doesn't start when she starts, but her origin is told in flashbacks. So the main plot of this story is that someone in Gotham is framing the Huntress and killing mafia men. And this is really believable because Huntress is, Helena Bertinelli is the daughter of a mob boss, and when she was 8, her family was murdered by an assassin hired by one of the competing mob families. And since then, she became the Huntress, and she killed some of the people responsible for her family's death, which I'm not going to condone murder, but it's a little bit understandable. The story really, no, she didn't do it in this story. And so the person framing her is part of the mystery. And then another part of the mystery of the story is Helena's asking herself this question of, so her father, her mother, and her brother were killed in front of her, but then they also established within the story that every single Bertinelli in Gotham was extinguished that night. Like, all her cousins, her aunts and uncles, even people who weren't related, who just had the misfortune of having the last name of Bertinelli, because someone wanted to wipe out anyone who had a claim to the Bertinelli name. So that's pretty horrific. And so Helena is asking the question of why she was spared, because someone gave the order to spare the sister. And Helena's asking that. So that's kind of the mystery. Those are the two mysteries that drive the story as Helena's going through the story and trying to figure out what's going on. And then you have the Bat family, of course, sticking their noses in it because mobsters are ending up dead in Gotham, and it could be this rogue vigilante that's running around. So that's kind of fair. And the story does a good job of exploring the parallels between Helena and Batman, because they both lost their families at the same age. And it also explores the parallels between Helena and another character that pops up, the Question, aka Vic Sage. Vic Sage shows up. They don't really say specifically why he showed up, except that he showed up wanting to help Helena, because he was curious about her, and he saw something of himself in her. So he shows up, and he kind of whisks her away to Richard Dragon, who is kind of like this Zen master of martial arts. And Richard Dragon, he gets her to Richard Dragon to try to help teach her to center herself. So the story really revolves around Helena unraveling this mystery of her past and who's framing her. And it really is a very cinematic story and dives into this, both the superhero vigilante thing and a lot of, it's a very like mob type story, like mob crime, and talking about all those dynamics. And we got a little bit of that in the Birds of Prey movie, so I can understand why they had this as the tie-in story, but I would love someday to see a standalone Huntress movie that follows this story a little more closely, or at least an animated movie, because it's just such a great story. Like, the very last scene is just really well done, and there's some really good character moments in it. So if you've ever been curious about Huntress, I highly recommend picking this up. Like, I ended up getting this version because I owned the original version in digital, but the original version is a little bit more expensive because it was out of print. So I was really glad they brought this back into print, and it's definitely worth a read. It's still one of my favorite graphic novels, and I feel like it's really underrated, which is kind of what I'm trying to do with this show, is highlight some of the more underrated, overlooked comics, because everyone's heard of some of the bigger name comics at this point. But this is by Greg Rucka, who I absolutely love, and I will read pretty much everything with his name on it, and I suggest you do too. So thanks for spending some time with me this week, and happy reading. Let me know in the comments what you're reading and what you'd like me to read next. Thank you.